The real Morgan reference, I mean Voduke. Hello and welcome to my first companion review for Legends of Kingdom Rush. I'm going to be starting with the Knight.
I will protect you.
Because the Knight is such a straightforward companion, it gives me a lot of room to explain the mechanics of the game. So, let's start with the Knight at level 1. At level 1, the Knight's stats are 5 HP, 6 armor, 2 armor regeneration, 3 attack, and 2 speed. Some of these stats aren't actually important on their own. I don't really care too much about how much HP a unit has, because I don't like to let them suffer HP damage to begin with. That being said, the Knight does have a significant amount of HP, but this is an exception to how I usually view HP. Let's say that you happen to be in range of an Unblinded Exalted. His magic attack deals 4 damage maximum, so the Knight is safe from being killed even if she takes maximum damage from that attack. Compare this to the Dark Knight, who would get one-shotted even though he serves pretty much the same role as a tank in the front lines. But like I said, HP isn't the most important thing to look at when it comes to tanking. Armor regenerates every turn, so it's best to tank as many attacks as the armor stat can withstand before it gets to HP. The Knight's armor stat is 6, which means that she can take up to 6 physical damage from enemies before any physical attacks start to affect her HP. At the start of her turn each round, she will regenerate 2 armor, so she has the potential to tank more attacks depending on the damage of enemies and how much armor she has total now. Let me explain how armor works. For example, if an enemy deals 3 to 5 damage each turn and attacks her for 5 damage, then she will be left with 1 armor. Then, at the start of the Knight's turn, she will regenerate 2 armor for 3 total. Now she only has the potential to tank the enemy's attack if it deals the minimum amount of damage, which is 3. If you get unlucky, the enemy will roll 4 or 5 damage on its attack, which would deplete her 3 armor and then deal 1 or 2 health damage respectively. So I hope that clarifies how armor works with units. Another stat that doesn't mean much on its own is the attack stat. Having 3 attack doesn't mean anything just yet. Every skill that a unit has deals damage based on a formula. That formula can vary depending on the skill, so whether or not the attack stat is even a part of the equation is something you just have to see. So we'll see how much this stat is used when we look at the Knight's skills. Finally, there's her speed stat. The speed stat dictates how many hexes a unit can move when it's their turn. Most playable characters in the game have 2 movement speed, just like the Knight, so this makes her standard in that regard, which is perfectly fine. Now let's discuss the Knight's passive traits. The first is Fortify. If the Knight ends a turn without using a skill, she gains an additional 2 armor until her next turn. Unlike her armor regeneration, this extra 2 armor from Fortify can exceed her maximum armor stat. So, she can have 8 armor total if she isn't missing any armor when she ends her turn this way. As a passive, it is always possible for this to trigger. So if you want the Knight solely to be tanking, you can keep ending turns without using skills to gain an additional 2 armor. Since she regenerates 2 armor each turn, you can guarantee yourself 4 armor at the start of each turn by using Fortify. It's time to take a detour from the Knight herself to talk about the meta of Legends of Kingdom Rush. There are enough enemies that deal a certain amount of damage that I consider those damage numbers to be breakpoints. Acolytes, Tentacles, Goblins, Orc Archers, and Wolves all deal between 1 and 3 damage with their attacks. So, 3 armor is the first breakpoint because that's the amount needed to guarantee that you don't lose HP from those attacks. 4 is the next breakpoint, and in my opinion, it is the most important armor breakpoint. Trolls, Skeletons, and Demon Spawn deal 2 to 4 damage, and those are all the basic enemies of their respective adventures. So, being able to tank their attacks without suffering HP loss is very helpful. The Knight, being able to gain 4 armor per turn with Fortify, guarantees that you can tank an attack from one of these enemies every single turn. Even at level 1, she has the potential to permastall at least a single unit. This will help buy time for your other units to attack and finish off enemies, and in some cases, it can buy them enough time to fully heal themselves with their abilities. But I'll get into that more later. This isn't the extent of the Knight's tanking potential though. Her other passive, Block, is one of my favorite passives in the game. It gives the Knight a 25% chance to take 0 damage from any physical attack directed at her. This includes ranged attacks, as long as they are physical damage. The only exceptions besides magic and true damage attacks are some AoE attacks. What makes this skill so powerful is the fact that it completely negates the damage of attacks. so even very powerful strikes from enemies can turn into 0 damage dealt to the knight. I don't care if it doesn't deal any damage back to the enemies. Seeing consecutive blocks against attacks is one of the most hype things that can happen in this game. Block is an RNG dependent skill, so it's usually not wise to rely on it for protection. But if the knight's block prevents her from suffering any damage, it gives you more armor to rely on in the next round, which means more freedom to attack. Speaking of attacking, the knight's first skill is Slash. Every unit's first skill is what I like to call their basic attack, and they have one thing in common. The cooldown for the skill is always 0 turns. This means that the skill takes 0 turns to recharge after being used, so it's always available on the knight's turn. The damage is 2 to 4 physical damage. These numbers come from the formula that the attack uses, which is as follows. Her minimum damage is her attack stat minus 1. So the 2 comes from her attack stat of 3 minus 1. Then her maximum damage is her attack stat plus 1, which is where the 4 comes from. If her attack stat changes, then the damage of Slash will change too. This attack also has an epic effect, which means that if certain conditions are met, then additional effects take place. In this case, the effect is plus 2 physical damage on the attack, while the condition is that the target is weakened. So now I have 2 things to explain. The first is what it means to be weakened. There are 3 different status effects that can be inflicted on units that count as being weakened. Those are bleeding, burning, and poisoned. So if the knight attacks an enemy who is bleeding, burning, or poisoned, her epic effect will trigger. The second thing I have to explain is how an epic effect influences the skill. In this case, it's very straightforward. Her Slash does 2 more damage than it otherwise would have. So it goes from the 2 to 4 damage that it normally does to 4 to 6 against a weakened target. There is no cooldown for epics to trigger, so she can do this on the next turn too, assuming her target is also weakened. The effect does not stack when the enemy has multiple weakened statuses on them. So if the enemy is burning and poisoned, she still deals 4 to 6 damage. It should be clarified that the epic damage is not always plus 2. Rather, it is her attack stat divided by 2. As far as I know, all instances of a number being divided by 2 will be rounded up in this game. So, 3 divided by 2 is 1.5, but that rounds up to 2 more epic damage. If her attack stat is increased to 4, the damage will be 4 divided by 2, which is still 2, so it will look like there's no change. But if her attack stat is increased to 5, then the epic damage is 5 over 2, which is 2.5, and that rounds up to 3. So I hope that's clear. In any case, Slash is proof that the knight does not deal very high damage. She only does physical damage too, so the knight isn't a character you rely on for killing enemies. The damage is nice to have so that she can soften up or finish off enemies, but that necessitates the intervention of other party members. Specifically, party members who can do enough damage to be relied on as killers. This suggests that the knight plays more of a support role, and her second ability reinforces this idea. Shield Bash is the other skill option she has at level 1. This ability deals her attack damage minus 1 as physical damage, and it inflicts stun. So, instead of having a range of options like Slash, Shield Bash always does the same amount of damage. The stun effect lasts for 1 turn. Stun is one of a few afflictions that counts as being immobilized. It prevents the stunned unit from moving, attacking, or even benefiting from some passive traits. So, if the knight herself got stunned, she would not gain the fortified bonus when her turn comes around. Instead, the turn just passes by and things proceed normally from there. In essence, it wastes the unit's turn completely. The only thing that a stunned unit can do is regenerate health and armor, if they have regeneration for those stats. They can also receive buffs from their allies, or damage and debuffs from enemies. That last part is important, because it means the stunned enemy is susceptible to attacks from your other units too. There are companions and legends whose skills have epic effects that trigger on immobilized enemies. Combining the Knight stun with allies' epic effects can end up doing more damage total. The stun has an epic effect of its own as well. Weakened targets will be stunned for 2 turns instead of 1. Shield Bash has a 2-turn cooldown. Skills start recharging at the end of a unit's turn. This means that when the Knight uses Shield Bash, her turn ends, and one of the 2 turns needed to recharge the ability has already passed. So on her next turn, there is only 1 turn remaining for the skill to recharge by, and that one will pass at the end of that turn. That means that normally, there is a 1-turn gap where the enemy is not stunned and is free to attack. Against enemies who deal physical damage, this is usually fine. Even on enemies who deal very high physical damage, the knight has little to fear. If she takes heavy damage to her armor, she can just stun the enemy, buying herself an extra turn to regenerate armor. The enemy can't attack, so she gets 2 armor back already. Then on the following turn, she will have regenerated 4 armor total, and can use the Fortify bonus to stack up to 6 armor total before the enemy's next move. It is very unlikely for enemies to pierce through this much armor, but if she uses Shield Bash on a weakened enemy, they don't even get a chance to try. Just make sure to check if the knight can outright kill the enemy with Slash instead, because that will still generally be more effective than just stunning them. Ultimately, the knight is a great companion at level 1. Even though she lacks the damage to effectively kill enemies, she makes up for it by serving a clear purpose, and serving it well. She is an excellent tank who has a lot of options for boosting her survivability. Combining her regen with Fortify and or Shield Bash allows her to stack up enough armor to tank even late game enemies for multiple turns in a row. All of this is just at level 1, but now let's see the knight at level 2. When the knight gets to level 2, her stats are increased. She now has 7 HP, 3 armor regeneration, and 4 attack. Her armor and speed are unchanged though. It's normal for speed to stay the same, but it's a bit unfortunate that she gets no additional armor at level 2. However, like I said about her at level 1, she does have the means to tank effectively against enemies even in the late game. So now that she regenerates 3 armor per turn, the combos I mentioned before are even more potent. 4 attack also means that she deals more damage with Slash and Shield Bash. But enough about what she's already been able to do. Let's take a look at her new abilities. To get a unit to level 2, you have to select one of the abilities locked behind a level 2. For the knight, these are Gain Terrain and Hold the Line. Once you pick one of these, the other option is closed off for the rest of the adventure. But the option you did choose is now available as a skill for any combat scenario. The knight's first option, Gain Terrain, is very similar to Slash. The damage formula is the same, with the minimum damage being her attack stat -1 and the maximum damage being her attack stat +1. It also has an epic effect that deals her attack stat divided by 2 as additional physical damage against immobilized targets. Both of these effects are nearly identical to Slash, the only difference being that the epic effect triggers against immobilized targets instead of weakened ones. However, this skill does have some traits that makes it stand out from Slash. First, it applies knockback to the target. Knockback is not a form of weakened or immobilized. It's a separate type of effect from either of those afflictions. It pushes the target 1 hex away from the damage source. The direction they get pushed in is always the opposite of the knight's. The only exception is when there isn't space to move them back, in which case they don't move at all. She is also allowed to use her remaining movement speed after the skill. So, she can attack an enemy right in front of her, and then move back by 2 hexes in order to retreat, or she can move 1 hex forward to attack an enemy, hit them, and then move 1 more hex. Finally, she can move 2 hexes towards an enemy, then use Gain Terrain, but then have no remaining movement to use. But now it's time for a quick detour from the review of the knight. This is the last that you'll be hearing of my loud and echoey voice for a while. The only way that I can record videos on my iPad without my voice sounding even worse requires a really stupid setup. I have to put my iPad on my bed and then lean over my bed to get really close to the microphone and record my voice like that. It's not comfortable and it leaves me out of breath, which makes it take forever to record videos. But my iPad is the only way I can get footage for the games that I have on it. So, I have to use it for Legends. But I have a new setup. I've got a microphone for my computer that I'm going to use to record my voice from now on, and that has sped up the process tremendously. I still have to do more stupid shenanigans though. First, I have to record my voice and upload that to YouTube as an unlisted video. Then, I have to screen record the video with my iPad so that it's saved there. And finally, I put that together with the footage of Legends of Kingdom Rush to make an actual coherent video. Rate my setup. This skill has 2 downsides. The first is that it has a 3-turn cooldown. Considering it's almost equal in power to Slash, which is not very strong, it isn't something that warrants a cooldown like this. Knockback and extra flexibility with movement are just not good enough to need this long of a cooldown in my opinion. But now that I've complained about it, there's a chance it will get buffed and make this video outdated. Either way, the second downside with Gain Terrain is the fact that it has to compete with Hold the Line as an option. Most of the time, I find Hold the Line to be the preferable option. I will say that Gain Terrain still has its uses though. You can pull off some big brain 200 IQ I Watch JoJo's moves with this, but the same can be said with most skills. I already went into extensive detail about how to manipulate the knight's Fortify and Shield Bash options, and the same can be done for any of her abilities. However, there are some abilities that just have a better chance of being more useful in combat. Hold the Line is just that, a skill with a better chance of being more useful. This ability grants the knight and any units adjacent to her an additional 4 armor for 2 turns. Like Fortify, this bonus armor can exceed the maximum that armor regen can reach. Since I didn't mention it before, armor regen will still apply if the unit doesn't have max armor. So, if the knight has 5 out of 6 armor, then uses Hold the Line, she will have 9 armor total, but on her next turn, her regen will trigger to restore the 5 to 6, so she gains an additional 1 armor for 10 total. The same is true for any other allies with armor regen. Hold the Line is the first skill here that isn't an attack, it's a buff. This means that you don't have to use an enemy in range to activate it. You don't even need any other allies in range to use it, since the knight is a target herself. Turns are counted in a very particular way, so let's go into detail about what happens when a skill like this lasts for 2 turns. Like I explained with Shield Bash, skills recharge by 1 turn after a unit ends their turn. This includes the same turn that the knight uses Hold the Line. So, 1 turn has already passed for the duration and the cooldown once she uses the skill. That means that on her next turn, she will still have the 4 armor from Hold the Line, but when that turn ends, it takes the cooldown and duration. The skill only has a 2-turn cooldown, so it will be ready to use on her following turn, but for now, the duration has ended. So she's left without the bonus armor until her next turn comes, leaving her vulnerable for a little bit. Allies that are affected by the buff will appear to get it for longer. That's because they will have the armor from the time the knight uses it up until the end of their turn. So after the knight uses Hold the Line, they will have 4 bonus armor. Then when their first turn since getting the buff ends, it will tick the duration by 1 turn. They still keep the buff. Then, once it comes to their next turn, the buff will last until that turn is over. Somewhere in between this time, the knight will get another turn and her buff will wear off. So allies typically get the bonus 4 armor for a little longer than the knight. Hold the Line has no epic effects, but it removes the sleep affliction if any units have it. I find that applying 4 additional armor to units is a lot more helpful than gain terrain, so this is the one that I generally pick. The armor bonus allows units who otherwise aren't great tanks to be able to enter dangerous territory and pull off more daring moves. In that regard, it enables you to do more damage, which is always a plus in my book. Units who are already tanky become tankier, so you can set up some really serious blockades when the knight fights alongside another unit with heavy armor. So that's the knight at level 2. Though her skills aren't bad, in fact they opened up a nice set of possible new tactics, I don't think that getting her to level 2 is that high of a priority. Her stat gain is nothing special, especially since she doesn't get more total armor. Even if she did though, she works fine at level 1. But having a low priority to level up has a hidden benefit, which I will explain later. But for now, let's talk about the knight at level 3. Now she has 8 HP, 9 armor, 4 armor regeneration, 5 attack, and 2 speed. This is what I'm talking about. I don't care too much about the HP, but finally getting a buff to her armor is great. Now that she has 4 armor regeneration as well, it's going to be incredibly difficult to break through to her HP with physical attacks. As for her abilities, the first option you've got is Charge. Select a hex from anywhere between 1 and 4 hexes away to move the knight there. There will be a red path traced over the hexes between the knight and her destination. Any enemies on this red path are going to be hit, taking her attack -1 as physical damage and being inflicted with bleed. The bleed does an additional 2 damage to them as soon as they commit an action, whether it's moving, attacking, or anything else. Since enemies almost always perform actions, this damage is pretty much guaranteed, so Charge actually has pretty decent damage compared to her other attacks. But the main utility of this skill, in my opinion, is the ability to move her up to 4 hexes away. She can't be moved to hexes that are already occupied, but otherwise, she is free to use this to travel more hexes than she would with her normal movement. Do not forget that this skill is a full action. A full action means that the character has to use this as their only act for that turn. This means no moving around beforehand. So you cannot use the extra movement by going 2 hexes with their regular movement first and then using Charge. It has to be used at the very start of her turn or not at all. The one exception to this is when the knight is invigorated. This is a status effect that can occur outside of combat, and it increases the character's movement by 1, while also turning all full actions into simple actions. Simple actions are skills that can be used even after moving. Now that that's clear, let's move on to her final skill. Shield Harangue is another full action that has the knight throw her shield out to attack enemies, then return back to her. It does damage twice to the enemies that are in range. Both times, it is physical damage equal to her attack stat divided by 3, rounded up. Unlike charge, this damage can apply to allied units as well, so aim it very carefully. Personally, I prefer charge by a lot. There is certainly an advantage to being able to attack an enemy from a range without having to get up close to them. However, the range is a bit too short from only 3 hexes away. Ranged enemies were already being reached to attack the knight from this distance, and the fact that this is a full action means that she cannot close the distance herself first. Meanwhile, charge successfully makes up for a weakness that the knight has, which is her mobility. Now she can cross a greater distance when otherwise she might have been unable to do anything useful for that turn. It just proves to be helpful in more situations more often for me, so this is what I recommend upgrading most of the time. With all of that out of the way, let's talk about how the knight synergizes with other party members. First, when it comes to XP, she synergizes with everyone. Thanks to the fact that she makes her a perfect tank against physical attacks at level 1, you can afford to leave her at level 1 the whole time. This opens up room for you to spend your experience points on other party members, so you can afford to bring along heroes for whom it is a much higher priority to level up, and get them maxed out as soon as possible without suffering any consequences for neglecting the knight. This also means that if she appears as a random 4th companion, you don't have to change up any of your plans for how to level up your party, so she can fit into most any composition. The knight is also the least cumbersome unit to take negative effects when moving from node to node. If a unit gets exhausted, they receive a penalty to their movement by 1 point, and can either move or attack, but can't do both. They also don't receive any bonus effects like Fortify if they end a turn after moving, even if they didn't attack. If any unit in your party has to get exhausted, the knight is the one best fit to shoulder that burden. It's worse when characters get exhausted and you depend on them for damage because they have more trouble getting in and out of range to attack. But the knight's main purpose is to tank, so she tends to stay put anyways. This is another way that she makes for a great addition to any team. She's not the best choice for giving stat buffs to. If you happen upon a weaponsmith, armorsmith, or any items that boost attack or armor, the knight is a poor choice to give these stat boosts to. The reason is that she is already a fine enough tank with the armor that she has, and she deals low enough damage that boosting it at all will only make it closer to average. It won't ever be anything special. As negative as that sounds, this is still a good thing. Like experience points, the knight doesn't rely on stat boosts as much to be useful. You can spend those things on other party members instead. Those party members who benefit more from those stat boosts will provide more for your party overall, so you aren't missing out a significant amount of potential by not giving them to the knight instead. When it comes to specific character synergy, she stacks best with ranged characters who need someone to tank for them. Examples include Bruxa, the Arcane Wizard, and more. The Ranger in particular makes for a great combo with the knight. If he applies poison to an enemy, that means the enemy is weakened. Then when the knight uses Slash or Shield Bash on the enemy, it triggers her epic effect. Shield Bash is especially good here, because you can continually apply poison to an enemy who is permanently stunned, effectively guaranteeing their death. When combined with other tanky characters, it can seem like overkill to have so many tanking options. However, as long as you can make something useful out of a party of tanks, you can win a combat encounter. One technique is to back out of combat with the knight after she has taken a beating, letting her regenerate her armor in the meantime. While that's happening, you can have your other tank, or tanks, tank. The enemy will give them a beating, at which point you can swap those units out for the knight again, and repeat the process until you defeated them all. Alternatively, she can fight alongside all of the tanks at the same time to create an impenetrable wall. Hold the line stacks amazingly well with other tanks, making them capable of surviving otherwise fatal beatings. Having more tanks means that you can afford to make more daring decisions, like using full actions or other skills that will put your units in danger. I still find it more helpful to pair her with ranged companions so that it doesn't come to the point where you take more daring risks, but the playstyles are both valid. In each adventure, the knight has a place. Krumthek's Dominion is great for her because of the plethora of basic enemies who deal physical damage. Stormcloud's Winter also has mostly enemies who deal pure physical damage. Extra Dimensional Menace is where she falls off a bit, as enemies who bypass armor are more common. It limits the ability to tank when she can't rely on her armor to do that for her. Wild Moon is a great place for the knight though. The scarcity of experience points there means that the player can delegate all of their XP to the other party members because the knight is just fine on her own. If she is able to permastall an enemy, she can buy the time needed for characters to fully heal themselves. There are plenty of other little tricks that you can do with the knight, but this video will never end if I list them all. Ultimately, the knight is a very reliable companion. She doesn't try to spread out her usefulness by mixing in damage at the cost of tanking potential. She is a pure tank, so she gets to be the best at what she does. Min-maxed characters tend to be my favorite ones to use, and the knight is a shining example of that. More than that though, the knight is also the female version of a Chad. Her dialogue when you recruit her as a 4th companion literally says, "Well, it certainly looks like you could use the muscle." This is a Sigma female. So remember, when she tells you,
Get behind me.
you better listen. Now, this review was already far longer than any companion review needs to be. I just wanted to make sure that the mechanics of the game were thoroughly explained. That being said, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the game was still a mystery to anyone who doesn't have it. There's so much more to it, like the enemy design itself, but this is as much information as I can give in one video. If I do more of these reviews, expect them to be shorter and focus on the companion only. With that said, have a great day.